Good day, and welcome to the Foley Supply Chain Worries Keeping You Up at Night? What You Need to Know conference call. Today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Mr. Michael Flanagan. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Mike Flanagan, partner and co-chair of Foley's Food and Beverage Industry team. I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Supply Chain Worries Keeping You Up at Night? What You Need to Know. I should probably amend that title to say some things you need to know, because there's a wide range of supply chain issues impacting companies in the food and beverage industry, and these issues could easily fill a multi-day program and still only scratch the surface. Today we're going to highlight some of the issues for you, including valuation questions, inspections and recalls, contracting issues, and Foreign Corrupt Practice Act considerations related to suppliers. A number of my colleagues will be joining me on the panel today. Dave Clark is a partner and business lawyer at Foley. He represents both public and private companies and advises clients on acquisitions and divestiture transactions, including various types of cross-border transactions, commercial transactions, and general corporate matters. Rich Casper is a partner in our business law department and a member of our food industry team. Rich represents clients on the full spectrum of commercial matters affecting businesses, including licensing, purchasing, selling, lending, distribution agency, and bankruptcy. His clients include manufacturers and vendors of a diverse array of goods and services, including agricultural implements, manufacturing equipment, food, and other consumer products. Dave Simon is a partner with the firm's litigation group and provides compliance advice, conducts internal investigations, defends companies against enforcement actions, and represents companies in litigation. David Rosen is a partner and the co-chair of the firm's Life Sciences Group and a member of our food industry team. David has extensive experience in health law, life sciences, and food and drug regulation, including a range of FDA regulatory issues affecting food, prescription and over-the-counter pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and biologics. And Dennis Cardozo is a public affairs director, co-chair of Foley's Federal Public Affairs Practice, and the chair of our California Public Affairs Practice. Prior to joining Foley, Dennis served 5 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives from California's 18th District. His committee roles included service on the House Rules Committee and the House Agriculture Committee and its key subcommittees, and he played a leading role in the formation of the 2007 Farm Bill and recent food safety legislation. Before we start, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping tips. A copy of the slides can be found in the Materials section of your screen. Questions can be submitted electronically during the web conference by using the Q&A tab. And Foley will apply for 1 general CLE credit for today's program. All New York, New Jersey, and Kansas attendees applying for CLE credit must fill out an attorney affirmation form and write down the course code that will be announced at some point of the web conference. The attorney affirmation form can be obtained in the Materials section on your screen. With that behind us, I'll now turn the program over to Dave Clark.
Thank you, Mike. This is David Clark. I'm a partner in the business law department here in the Milwaukee office of Foley and Lardner, and a significant part of my practice focuses on supply chain matters primarily relating to internal and external logistics, including warehousing, transportation, and shipping. And in connection with that, I routinely advise clients on a variety of customs matters. As you can imagine, in the ever-increasing globalization of supply chains, there are a number of customs issues that companies should be aware of. But today I want to focus on valuation, an issue which I am increasingly encountering with a number of our clients. Proper valuation of imported merchandise is important because most duty rates are based on a percentage of the value of the imported products. In order to properly determine and pay duties, you need to know the value of the merchandise that you're importing so you can properly declare that. We're seeing 2 key issues around valuation. The first one relates to affiliate or related party transactions, so the sale of goods from an overseas related party to a company in the United States. The other issue is around assists that are provided by the U.S. company for manufacturing or developing products overseas. If we look first at transaction value, The stated position of U.S. Customs and the statutes and regulations is that in determining the value of your merchandise, you'll look at a transaction value, which is essentially the price paid or payable for the merchandise when sold for export into the United States. So if you're purchasing from a third party, the purchase price that you pay, excluding things like shipping costs or duties or taxes, that's what you would declare for purposes of the valuation of the merchandise for customs entry. There are limitations around your ability to use that when you are importing goods from an affiliate or a related party. Customs is determined and the regulations state that transaction value, again, this price payable, is acceptable in related party transactions so long as you can establish that either, one, the circumstances of the sale indicate that the relationship between the buyer and seller did not affect the price, or, if you're unable to demonstrate those circumstances, two, that the transaction value closely approximates the value of identical or similar merchandise. And you would determine that through the use of alternative valuation methodologies. When we're looking at whether or not you have a related party, I think it's important to note that the customs regs define related party very broadly. So if you are dealing with family members, if you're dealing with an organization that an officer or director of your company is involved with overseas, if you're dealing with an entity that has shares in 5% control or shares common control, you are deemed to be a related party. So this extends beyond typical affiliates and would apply to joint venture entities, partnership arrangements, things along those lines where you have some control over the entity abroad. So if we look a little bit closer at the two tests for determining whether or not you can use transaction value as part of determining, or as a method for determining the valuation of your goods, let's look first at the circumstances of the sale analysis. So customs regulations state that the first thing we're going to do is look to see if the intercompany transfer price is consistent with normal pricing practices in the industry. So is your related party selling the goods to you at the same price they would sell it to third parties? Or do you have a different internal pricing for sales amongst related parties? Are they arising at the price the same way they would with third parties? Are the negotiations proceeding the way they would? Is there a bid and ask process? Is there a negotiation? All those things would indicate that you are dealing with circumstances of the sale where it's normal in the pricing practice. There are a few other things that you can do in the event that you don't have those kind of typical third-party arm's length interactions with your related parties. You can have a bilateral advanced pricing agreement that's approved by the IRS. Customs has said in those instances, circumstances of the sale indicate that this would be customary pricing. You can have an accounting firm conduct a transfer pricing study, again, to confirm that the pricing the affiliates are charging is consistent with what you would typically see in the industry. And then also you can have detailed descriptions of the internal sale process. So again, the way that you're arriving at that price that your affiliate or related party is charging to you. If you're unable to satisfy any of those situations, you can also look at whether or not the intercompany transfer price is sufficient to allow the affiliate seller to recover a profit. The key here is that the profit needs to be equivalent to the overall global enterprise's profit. So if your affiliate is selling a product to you and making a 5% profit on that, but the profit margins typically for that line of business on an enterprise basis are 10%, it is unlikely that Customs is going to look at this as being the actual value. So again, number of ways that you can look at circumstances of the sale and conduct an analysis there in order to determine that the price you're being charged is the fair value to use. If you're unable to satisfy circumstances of the sale analysis, you can look at test values. This is an alternative valuation method. And for test values, basically what you want to establish is that The transactional value is either identical or similar to products and sales to unrelated purchasers in the United States, or you can get to what's called the deductive or computed value. For the identical or similar sales products, first you'll look to identical, whether or not the products are identical. Customs has determined that in order for merchandise to be deemed identical, it really needs to be the same except for minor immaterial differences in appearance. That can be a difficult test for you to establish, and again, unless your affiliate is selling to third parties in the United States. You can look to the similar products, and in that instance, really what we're focusing on is whether or not the products are similar, and are they commercially, can you commercially substitute one for the other. If you've done that, again, you can point to the value of sales for those products and help to determine that the use of the transaction value is appropriate. Those are particularly difficult for importers to satisfy. Customs does not routinely accept those. If they do, you can use that analysis going forward, but that's typically a difficult burden for folks to overcome. The deductive value or the computed value, if you're unable to satisfy on the identical or similar products, is you look at, once the importer then sells the product in the United States, what's the sale price, and then you take out their profit, transportation costs, duties, taxes, et cetera, and come to that value. And again, the question is, do you closely approximate, is what you were charged from your affiliate or related party supplier, is that closely approximate your sale price in the United States? If so, then you're able to use the transaction value. The other key item that we've been seeing around the outsourcing and offshoring of supply chain relates to dutiable assists. And so you might be asking, what are dutiable assists? Well, assists are things that a U.S. manufacturer will provide to its supply chain abroad, be it affiliate or unaffiliate, will provide to its supply chain abroad for purposes of manufacturing, designing, developing products. So you're looking at materials, components, parts, other items that are incorporated into or added into the imported products. You're looking at tools, dies, molds, equipment that are used in the production or manufacture of the products, merchandise that is consumed in the production. So if you're providing materials that get used up as part of the production or manufacturing process, those are dutiable assists. Any engineering, development, artwork, design work, plans, sketches, similar things that you're using kind of in the design and development stage, if those are performed abroad, they are typically dutiable assists and need to be added to the price that you are declaring for purposes of the valuation of your goods. So you might ask, well, why do we care about dutiable assists? Why should we be tracking this thing? We've seen a recent increase in both customs emphasis on trying to identify and accounting for assists, looking closely at companies that have been moving manufacturing operations offshore or that are increasing research and development activities abroad. From your perspective, everyone has a duty under the customs requirements for reasonable care and providing the information necessary to customs to determine proper valuation. So if you are providing these things, you have a duty of care to make sure that you're tracking and providing the information to customs. So this is important in terms of your compliance with customs regulations. It can be a little difficult to identify dutiable assists for a number of reasons. For instance, test equipment that is used in the manufacture or production of merchandise, if it's used in the production, it should be included as a dutiable assist. Engineering, research, development work provided abroad, whether or not you need to include things that are used for prototypes that aren't ultimately brought to production. Yes, you should be including those in your dutiable assist. Again, if you are providing that value to your manufacturer, the thought is your manufacturer would be charging you for those things if it provided them itself. If your supplier was doing those things itself, it would be incorporated into the price that you'd be paying. Master global purchase agreements. We're all now working with suppliers that are providing several divisions or affiliates under one master purchase agreement, being able to tick and tie supplies back and the cost back for, again, tools, equipment that you may be providing. You need to be able to track those items. And then finally, apportioning the value of assist across merchandise brought into the United States, as well as merchandise that will be exported abroad to other countries. So if you are importing into the United States and Canada, you need to be able to apportion the value of the assist between those products. The bottom line rule from customs perspective is, however you decide to value and apportion these things, it needs to be consistent with U.S. GAAP. Doing so, and then the way that you pay them, if you pay them all in one lump sum or amortize them over the cost of products, again, as long as it's consistent with U.S. GAAP, you're typically okay in terms of adding those values to the dutiable assists. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Thanks, David. We did get one question in by email, and there may be others that I can come back to you with. But the one that has come in so far is, what are some of the other customs issues that you've seen recently that impact importing products from foreign suppliers?
Yeah, so a number of things I think that rise to the level of supply chain concerns. One of them obviously is country of origin and labeling country of origin. So identifying the country where the last substantial transformation occurred and took place of a product, that is essential in terms of determining where you actually are bringing the products from, and that drives things like duty rates, quota restrictions, and the like. So country of origin is certainly a key issue, and then making sure that your products are labeled. Another issue that has sprung up recently is marking products that are maybe commingled in the United States. So you're bringing products in from various countries and packaging them together, parts and accessories, and you package them together into one package that you're then going to be shipping. How do you go about labeling the containers and the products and tracking where those products came from so that you can make sure that the end user, in this case the retail purchaser, is aware of where those products come from. So again, relates to country of origin, but has a little bit of an implication here in terms of making certain that your end users know that country of origin, and it's an issue that's popping up more and more as folks are having a repackaging service here in the United States. So those are a couple of items that come to mind.
Thanks. We may circle back, but let's keep things moving and turn it over to Rich Casper for commercial contracting issues.
Thanks, Mike. I imagine that not many of you are going to be surprised by the fact that, in light of my bio, my first recommendation to you in managing relationships with your supply chain is to have a written agreement. Contracts are kind of my life. It's what I do for a living: draft, review, revise contracts, negotiate them. But it is not always the case that I advise clients, particularly clients that are acting as buyers rather than sellers, not to enter into formal written contracts if there are better alternatives, and the primary alternative is a forms exchange. Forms exchanges, when I'm referring to them today, I'm referring to exchanges of good forms between well-advised buyers and sellers, and exactly what that constitutes is well beyond the scope of what I can cover in this short talk. But in that situation, buyers are given a very significant advantage. They are entitled under the Uniform Commercial Code, which covers all sales of goods in the United States. They're entitled to very broad warranties on what they're buying, and they're entitled to essentially unlimited remedies against their suppliers for problems with products themselves or with the performance of the suppliers under the transactions that they're engaging in. However, in the food industry, forms exchanges are generally unwise, which is why I'm recommending that in managing supply chain relationships in the food industry, you have written contracts. To begin with, there is no certainty that you are going to get supplied when all you're doing is exchanging forms with a supplier. There is no contract in that situation until the supplier actually ships the goods and you accept them. Secondly, the two principal statutes that you have to be concerned with in relying on forms exchanges are the Uniform Commercial Code, which I've already mentioned, and in international transactions, a treaty that we briefly call the CISG. And they are not well adapted to food industry issues. A couple examples. First of all, a very common practice in the food industry is toll manufacturing, where the customer will supply some sort of ingredient or component of the end product to a manufacturer that then produces the final product or an intermediate product. In that situation, the manufacturer is not selling a product, but is selling services, and services are not covered by either the CISG or the UCC. Another example generally is IP issues, and we could talk a long time on the subject, but again, in the food industry, there is often a relationship that exposes members of a customer's supply chain to recipes and sometimes even to processes developed by the supplier to produce a product for the customer. And it's usually critical to that customer to know who owns the recipe and to have disclosed to it the know-how that may be used in producing the product and to have the right to use those intellectual property assets. And that can only really be done well in a written contract. In a written contract as well, and this is somewhat related to IP, but not strictly speaking an IP issue, a customer can usually insist that a supplier, at least during the term of the relationship, not deal with competitors of the customer. Even after the relationship, a brief post-term agreement not to compete can be put into a contract and can be very valuable to the customer in protecting its confidential information and processes. Most importantly, though, the reason to have a written contract is that in the food industry, the end of the supply chain is consumer, who takes the product and puts it in his body or her body. And if there is a problem with the product, it's going to have repercussions all up the supply chain from that end consumer. Further, at the level of the supply chain, whole supply chain just above the consumer, is usually a very sophisticated retailer who has not only the will but usually the economic power to insist on pretty one-sided and draconian documents that its suppliers have to agree to in order to supply the customer. The Walmarts of the world and the Subways of the world are the examples that I'm going to refer to at least a couple times today. So in that context, a food vendor can't manage its relationships with its supply chain as though they're in a vacuum. Instead, he has to consider what the responsibilities that he's taking on to his customer are and try to provide protection to himself from his suppliers if those suppliers create problems. Let's just take a look at a few of the areas where this comes into play. If you're managing a relationship with a supplier, you want to think about, when can I change prices to my customer? If I've committed to Walmart that I'm not going to make a price change, bring a price change into effect for a year, and I have suppliers that can change prices at any time, that can leave me in a very awkward position where I may, in the context of food products that can be volatile in price, I may be selling at a loss for a period of time? What's the scope of my liabilities to my customers? If you have, as you usually will, very broad responsibility for the consequences of product failures when you're selling to a retailer, you're going to want to make sure that your suppliers have similar responsibilities to you when they are the source of the problem. Otherwise, you're going to end up holding the bag in the middle between your customer and your supplier. And of course, in the recall areas, this is particularly acute. The large retailers are very demanding in terms of suppliers' responsibilities for recalls that the retailer may undertake in his own discretion. And you will want to have protection from your supply sources, again, to make sure that they stand behind their performance or non-performance where that becomes an issue. Even in the very kind of subtle and technical area of venue and governing law, you can put yourself in an awkward position if you don't have relationships with your suppliers that are reduced to writing on the same terms as what your customers have in their forms that you may have signed. If you've agreed, for example, with Subway that if you have any dispute with them, or they any dispute with you more likely, you have to litigate that matter in New Jersey, and you have a supplier that is in Washington State, for example, you may have inconsistent results in the two disputes. You may end up being liable in New Jersey based on what that court decides, and when you go to Washington to try to pursue your supplier, it may turn out that the Washington court will view the facts differently. So even that can be an area where you need to dovetail those two sources of contract rights and obligations. You also need to think about, particularly in the context of contracts with suppliers that are requirements contracts, that is, you agree to buy all of your requirements for a particular product from that customer, from that supplier, or volume commitments. What happens when there's a breach or even a force majeure? Can you and when can you go elsewhere? Can you go elsewhere on a spot basis? Do you have to buy just what you need to tide you over for some short period of time? Or can you enter into longer, intermediate, or long-term contracts that will save you money during that period of disruption? When can you terminate? Of course, also a very important topic if you have those kinds of commitments to your suppliers. That, I think, is pretty much what I intended to cover, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Rich. A couple questions have come in. The first one I think is interesting. It reads, it's a bit off the topic, but you mentioned dealing with Walmart and Subway. Is it practical to try to negotiate the standard forms that they ask you to sign?
It is practical. In both cases, I've done it. It requires a fair amount of money. Let's start with that. It also requires a fair amount of just stick-to-itiveness. You have to insist on getting beyond the level of the pure purchasing people who have their forms and have no authority to go beyond them. You have to insist on making certain changes. And it's very much the case that when you're trying to dovetail your relationships with your suppliers with the relationships you have with your customers, that it's a two-way street. That is, you have to try to determine how much you can get from your suppliers when you're negotiating with the Subways and the Walmarts of the world. And what you can't get from your suppliers, you have to try to at least get a corollary provision from your customers, or recognize that you're taking on a greater level of risk to your customer than your supplier is to you. Another one?
Another one that we can deal with now, before then we've got to move on to keep on schedule. The question reads, I was surprised to hear that I might be able to prevent one of my sources from selling to competitors. Isn't that restraint of trade?
Well, that is restraint of trade, but under the U.S. antitrust laws and under the laws of a great portion of the world where the antitrust law is frankly less developed, not all restraints of trade are illegal. It is only unreasonable restraints of trade that are illegal. And for the most part, particularly in an industry like food where there are a lot of available sources and outlets for products, a restriction like the one I was describing, that is particularly during the term of a relationship and for a short period of time after the relationship, is generally going to be viewed as a reasonable restraint on trade. In some cases, if you're a very critical supplier of something that is in scarce supply, you may have to do something else. But for the most part, those kinds of restrictions are viewed as reasonable and very commonly used.
Good. Thanks. Now let's move on to FCPA enforcement issues for supply chain. David Simon.
Yep. Hello. So I'm going to move fairly quickly through this because I think FCPA issues are, while they do touch on the supply chain piece, probably more of a worry on your external facing activities than on your purchasing chain. But it does implicate supply chain management, particularly in this industry. There is certainly a risk of you being held liable for bribes paid by your suppliers in order to facilitate the delivery of a product to you. It's not the norm, and it's not probably the highest risk activity you engage in every day, but there is risk. And so I wanted to just give a quick overview of the FCPA and how it might apply. I think everybody knows this is a criminal law with pretty serious consequences of attaching to violations. This slide just gives you a sense of some of the higher settlements that have been paid, and the Walmart case is a good example of the devastating cost of having to defend these actions. We pretty much think Walmart is going to replace Siemens at the top of this FCPA settlement once its problems get sorted out with the government. Enforcement has been high, and everybody thinks it's going to continue to remain high. And enforcement has been active in the food and beverage industry. This just gives you a sense of some of the companies that have had FCPA enforcement actions brought against them. Just basics on the FCPA, there are two components. One is the anti-bribery provision, and the other is the books and records / internal controls provision. I'm going to focus on the anti-bribery because that's really where the action is, but the books and records provision is worth just noting that the SEC in particular, although also the Department of Justice, can get you for, without proving that you actually paid a bribe, that they can get you for inaccurately recording the bribe in your books. So these are the elements: paying or offering to pay anything of value, directly or indirectly, to a foreign official, corruptly, for the purpose of influencing the official or to secure an improper advantage, to obtain or retain business. And we could do hours on each of these, but I just want to give you some of the highlights. Anything of value really means anything of value. These are just some examples. There are one of the highest profile current FCPA investigations right now involves J.P. Morgan and hiring sons and daughters of government officials as interns as a thing of value that implicates this act. Foreign official, also very broad, not just a typical government official, but also employees of state-owned or state-controlled enterprises are included. So when you're dealing in countries like China, almost everybody you interact with could be a foreign official and could implicate the FCPA. In terms of what is to obtain or retain business, these are just some examples. Anything really, any payment that's designed to influence a decision about a contract, about a procurement process, circumventing import rules or customs rules that might come up in this industry, gaining access to information, avoiding taxes or penalties, in influencing litigation or regulation or avoiding a contract termination. Any of those kinds of payments are going to fit within the FCPA. There is an exception that is sort of allows you to do gifts, meals, and entertainment and travel if you have expenditures that are to the benefit of a foreign official, but they're reasonable, they're bona fide, and they're directly related to either the promotion or demonstration of your product or the negotiation or execution of a contract. This is what allows you to, for instance, take a government official out to a business dinner, is this exception. Sometimes traveling and visiting factories or facilities or training also are included. Third parties are really the key risk area for Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, especially in this industry. One very important fact to keep in mind is that anything that is prohibited, that the company is prohibited from doing directly, they're also prohibited from doing indirectly. And a lot of, in fact, the vast majority of FCPA enforcement actions have involved payments not made directly by the companies who get nailed for it, but by agents, brokers, distributors, other kinds of intermediaries acting on their behalf. So that's where a key risk area is. I think important things to keep in mind as you think about your suppliers in particular and how they might expose you to FCPA liability. Due diligence is important to identify any kind of proclivity to corruption. The Department of Justice has made it clear that risk-based due diligence is important. So if you're hiring somebody to act on your behalf in the supply chain or buying in India or Brazil or Russia, it's more due diligence is required than in Norway or Canada. Other tips, in your contract, assuming you follow Rich's advice and have a written contract, you ought to include some anti-corruption FCPA reps and warranties, and potentially audit rights to make sure bribes haven't been paid. Transparent and traceable payment mechanism, no cash payments are important. And ultimately, there are red flags around whether price and commission and what you're paying the supplier or the intermediary is reasonable. If there's money to be kicked around that could be used to pay bribes, it creates FCPA risk. So that's just a real high-level overview of the law, how it might apply. I would just make one other point, which is, we talk about Walmart and Subway. I suspect some of you are dealing with, not in the supply chain context, but just as a customer of big entities like those, that they are pushing down their FCPA compliance onto their suppliers, and therefore you're probably dealing with this, or if you aren't yet, you probably will be, where in particular Walmart, once they get hung for their FCPA violations, they're going to be very particular about insisting that their business partners have appropriate FCPA compliance procedures in place. And so you may see more of this coming down the pipe. That's all, Mike.
Dave, one question came in that I think was based on something you flew through on your last slide. You have recommendations on approaches to third-party due diligence to manage FCPA and other risks.
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways to approach that issue. It's a challenging one that a lot of companies are wrestling with, managing their third-party networks, including their supplier networks. I would tell you that there's tremendous competition among vendors to provide this service. Companies like Kroll, the Red Flag Group, Steele, Thomson Reuters, among others, all offer systems and platforms that will help you do due diligence on your supply chain or on your third-party network. And the good news is that the competition is really leading to lower prices. So there's some good options. I would recommend, for most companies, it's better off just to outsource this and find a partner who can do it for you, because they can do it really much more cheaply. And if anybody's interested, I can give a list of those companies. If anybody wants to contact us after, I'd be happy to forward that on.
Good. Thanks. At this point, I mentioned in the introduction that New York, New Jersey, and Kansas attendees needed a super secret course code. The secret CLE code for this program is F as in Frank, 3, V as in Victor, U, F3VU. That, I'll turn it over to David Rosen for food safety, recall, and supply chain issues.
Well, thanks, Mike, and good afternoon, everybody. I want to bring you greetings from Washington, D.C. It doesn't look as bright and sunny as these pictures are. All the weather from the Midwest just passed through here about 45 minutes ago, and we had tornado warnings. The lights are flickering and things like that, so we were a little concerned that the two of us that are here in D.C., were going to lose power and things like that, but luckily we didn't do that. But it's always wonderful to be here in D.C., and the monuments are beautiful, and I encourage everybody to take advantage when you come to visit here. Of course, the President and the Cabinet sends their regards. It's always nice to know who you're dealing with. On the bottom, you have Dr. Margaret Hamburg, who's the current Commissioner of FDA, and she's been around for a while, and it's really nice to have some consistency at FDA in terms of top leadership, because she does set the regulatory agenda, and she has been very present in terms of food regulation, as well as in medical devices and drugs and other areas that are regulated by FDA. We also have a new Secretary of Health and Human Services, Shirley Burwell, and she came in after the Obamacare debacle that was here, and so it's nice to have somebody new at the top that things have been running smoothly, and actually she hasn't been in the news, so that is kind of nice. Of course, the dogs say hello. We always like to see the Obama's dogs, and they're out playing around all the time, and I can't say anything. I can't show pictures of dogs without showing my dog, too. My dog always has to be in these presentations, and you can ask how I got the President to hold a picture of my dog, but I'm not going to tell anybody. So, you know you've got a potential problem when you're nervous and the boss comes in, and it always happens late in the evening on a Friday, close of business, and we don't know where it was in the supply chain. It was a problem with the labeling, a problem with a different ingredient, or something wasn't cleaned appropriately somewhere along the line, and so it always happens that it's late at night, and everybody's a little nervous and things like that, so it makes it very difficult. Okay. And so after you pick yourself up off the floor, you've got to figure out what you're going to do. And I think Rich Casper gave some great advice about putting these things in writing and making sure that you have contractual provisions with respect to recalls, and we're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit more. What I can tell you is, you got to stay calm. You'll get through it. There's more recalls in the food area than there almost are in any other area of products that are regulated by FDA, and we see a lot of those with respect to labeling, or a lot of those issues with respect to potentially allergenic ingredients such as tree nuts, soy, milk products, eggs that aren't necessarily appropriately labeled on the product. We have to have a plan. We have to manage the situation both internally and externally, as well as with FDA. And depending where you are in the supply chain, some of these things may be out of your control. So we want to talk about those, and we want to make sure that there's a game plan in place prior to things happening, because unfortunately they do happen, and we'd rather be prepared than not. Oh, there we are. I'm a Boy Scout. I'm always prepared. So when we develop a plan, we try to build a consensus. We want to be responsible because we have the safety of the public is important. We have to decide if there's a recall, correction, market withdrawal, stock recovery, and those are all terms of art that are defined in the Code of Federal Regulations. We have to make a decision as to whether or not a recall is warranted, and we have to prepare appropriate communications. And again, depending on if you're the ultimate retail seller versus somebody who's somewhere along in the supply chain, different people are going to take on those responsibilities, and you want to have good communication. You don't want to be surprised because it will have an impact both financially as well as in public relations with your other customers too. So we really do want to make sure that we do have a plan. We also have to communicate with FDA. Somebody needs to take that responsibility. They need to do it quickly. They need to be organized. They need to be informed. And, we want to effectuate these recalls to make sure that we're going to protect the public. So we want to start those as soon as we can. But we also want to keep FDA well informed because they work with us closely with respect to the recall communications, the scope of the recall, the follow-up with respect to the effectiveness of that recall and things like that. So we really want to establish a responsible relationship with FDA wherever you are in the supply chain. And then we have to implement and we have to make sure that we do follow-up. We want to look at corrective and preventative actions. Okay, we want to, we have a lot of equipment that's involved in the manufacture of products, and that equipment needs to be maintained, so we have to have a good maintenance procedure. Still things break, and we have to make sure that we have, for example, metal situations where that can get into products, so that we try to prevent those, so we have fail-safes at the end that can kick things off the production line if those things were to end up in a product. So we just have to make sure that we have good policies and procedures in place and that they are implemented and that we test those things on a regular basis to make sure that we try to prevent these things from occurring in the future if they've occurred in the past. And it's not, and if you have products that have been either misbranded, they don't have the right labeling, things like that, or they've been adulterated, it's very difficult. You really can't donate that stuff. You most of the time end up destroying it. So it does. There's an economic consequence of all these issues. I want to stop here for a second, and I want to just turn it over to Congressman Cardozo because he was involved in the food safety legislation, and he's been very involved since coming to Foley, and I just wanted to give him a couple of opportunities to tell a few stories about what the thought was in Congress as this was going through. So, Dennis?
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. During the passage of the 2007 Farm Bill and beyond, I was the chair of the House Ag Committee on Horticulture and Organic Agriculture. And we held a series of hearings on food safety and supply chain issues such as tracking of fresh fruit and produce and inputs to processed foods that get into the supply chain if they've been adulterated, and how we track it and how we do recalls. There were a number of outbreaks, and these hearings were in response specifically to the leafy green and spinach outbreaks that happened during that time, and also the E. coli scare in tomatoes, which in fact turned out, and this is indicative of how things can get twisted, and it's part of the supply chain in processed foods, it turned out not to be tomatoes at all, and certainly not fresh market tomatoes, but it turned out to be jalapeno peppers that were placed into salsa mix and distributed around the country, and everybody assumed it was the tomatoes when it wasn't the tomatoes at all. Those jalapeno peppers came over across the border from Mexico, and in fact, we determined during the hearings that many of the problems were from foreign products being brought into the country where the standards of production may or may not be as high as they are in the United States. We, in doing our research, and we came across a couple of really glaring examples, one of which was there was lettuce being packed in Baja, California, or south of the border in Mexico, in Baja, next to a landfill site that was using water that was draining out of the landfill site, and the fields were strewn with trash. But what was even more disturbing than the products coming out of that kind of an environment were that they were being packed into boxes that were labeled California grown and inspected. We then took a video of that, and we closed that operation down, but only after the products had already been shipped across the border. Which leads us to the second point, is that we'd also determined that at that time, less than 1 in 10 truckloads of produce and products that were coming across the border were being inspected for either pests and carrying pests across the border, or also were being checked for contamination of other kinds. So that was what really led to the passage of the Food Safety Act that was passed in 2010. Now, I'll tell you, the congressional process there was less than pure, and in order to get the bill passed, there were some really bad provisions put into it. For example, a buffer area around the borders that said that the act didn't apply to small growers under $150,000 in gross revenue, or within a certain amount of miles in any U.S. border. So I ended up not voting for the bill and trying to oppose it because I felt there were some major loopholes, but the bill did pass and currently is in effect. I think David's going to talk to you a bit more about that. But this is an example of how we have to be very vigilant of our supply chain partners, and the previous speakers talked about the contractual arrangements. But in this case, we've now found that manufacturers or retailers like Walmart and others are maybe more picky about what goes into their shelves than even the government regulators, and their standards are oftentimes much more stringent. David, I'll turn it back to you with that.
Thank you, Dennis. It's one thing, you just don't want to know how laws get passed in this country, that's for sure. But I'm glad that we have some people that understand that too. So, CAPA programs, corrective and preventative action programs, are really the cornerstone or the key for making sure that we have appropriate controls in facilities to make sure that the products don't get adulterated and or misbranded as they go through the process. And it's important that companies do self-audits and they have a corrective plan going through to correct the issues that are identified, so that the FDA understands and appreciates that the company operates in a spirit of and in a realm of voluntary compliance, because the FDA can't be at every place at any time. But if you can show them during the course of your routine activities that you're monitoring the operations and you're doing things to correct things as you see them, you get a little bit more cooperation and respect if and when something goes on. So we see, prevention is very, very important, and we have a lot of tools to do that. Again, we have ways to approach prevention controls, doing root cause analysis, implementing controls, monitoring the effectiveness of those corrections, making any further corrections as deemed necessary to prevent things from recurring, and then continuing that process back around again to make sure that we don't have, we address the issue in a responsible manner. If you do that, you end up saving money in the long run. I know it's expensive to kind of add these types of internal controls during the course of your manufacturing, but the FDA expects you to do so, and it's, again, as I said, it's better off if you take a proactive approach as opposed to a reactive approach. What are the elements of a food safety plan? We can see very straightforward, where the major hazards, what kind of prevention controls do we have, having written procedures and things like that. So for implementation, some sort of corrective action procedures and monitoring and follow-up. That's where people get into a fair amount of trouble, is that they don't follow up in a timely fashion and they don't close out things in a in a manner that is consistent with their written standard operating procedures. So we want to take care of that. We want to make sure that things are verified and that they're effective, and then we also want to make sure that we have an appropriate recall plan and that we are able to implement that in a very short period of time, and people have assigned responsibilities to carry those out. Because as I said, those inevitably happen late in the afternoon on Fridays, on holiday weekends, or over the weekend. So we want to make sure that people know that they may have to give up a little bit of time to manage these types of things. What other things that people need to think about? Sanitation, training, environment, food allergens, good manufacturing practices, and supplier verification and audit processes. If you can manage that by going out and understanding and knowing your suppliers, you have a lot less potential for issues to come up during the supply of ingredients that are used in the manufacturing of your food products. I mean, if you know your suppliers and you're out there and you're looking at them, making sure that they are meeting the appropriate they have procedures in place, and then we know where they're getting their ingredients from, it certainly helps you maintain better control over the consistency and the quality of the products that you're pushing through in the supply chain. There's a port of entry inspection. FDA, of course, can refuse to admit products into the U.S. On the appearance if it was adulterated or misbranded, but we can't rely on that. The importers have responsibility for ensuring that they have adequate controls in place, and and as Dennis mentioned, the food from abroad has to be as safe as the food that's available domestically too. There's a number of safety mandates that have been now put in place in terms of supplier verification and qualified import program and higher risk foods, as well as notice of imported food shipments. You've got to tell people, tell FDA when things are coming in so that FDA knows. They are working with foreign governments on inspections and things of that sort too, and to looking at the targeting of FDA's inspectional resources. If you have issues, you can expect FDA to come visit, and they want to make sure that you're doing things so that there's no repeat offenders here. We have accreditation of third-party auditors so that people can get out there and do that themselves, so the FDA is relying on third parties at this point. There's been a number of offices opened in countries around the world that the FDA has done to try to help companies in foreign countries understand what FDA's expectations are, so that they're providing assistance here. And with smuggled food or food that doesn't meet appropriate standards, there's the government is trying to prevent that kind of entry into the United States. So best advice that we can give at this point is to know your suppliers, get references. If something's much less expensive than you've been able to get it in the past, there has to be a reason for that. You want to understand why. If something appears suspicious, it probably is. We want to audit your suppliers. Track and trace initiatives are moving forward in other areas, and I would expect that we may start seeing that in the food supply. It's expensive, but it's the kinds of information that you're tracking and you knowing where it goes will help you have better controls. And if there is a problem, it may help you limit your exposure with respect to those particular products that may have been adulterated and or misbranded. So we try to at least think about some basic track and trace types of initiatives that could help in the management of the supply chain. That's all I have, Mike. We want to make sure that our product is safe, and we wouldn't want to be like Snow White. So.
Thank you, David. We're just about to the end of the hour. A couple of questions did come in by email. The first one is pretty general. What are some of the biggest issues you've seen with supply chain security in the food industry?
I think it's been in that area where people have not, they don't know where some of the goods are coming from, and they're using goods from alternative suppliers that may be questionable in terms of their purity. And so we want to make sure that we don't have those types of issues, because once you get something like that and it adulterates the product, it can really have a significant impact on the product line, and then you have to go through a whole cleaning and cleaning validation process of your equipment to get rid of that stuff too. So that can be prevented by looking at making sure that we know who your suppliers are and having appropriate controls in your purchasing process, and making sure that the purchasing folks know what the requirements are before they let contracts out for alternative suppliers.
Okay. And the last one we have time for today is one I'm pretty sure I know your position on. The question was, do you think companies should conduct mock readiness audits concerning their recall procedures?
I think I would highly recommend that, especially, depending on where you are in the supply chain. And again, going back to what Rich was saying, is that, you may not have control over a decision to recall. At least you want communications, and you want that clearly delineated in any contracts that you have governing your relationships with people up and down the supply chain, because it will have a significant impact economically, and then as well as, a lot of these products are branded or have a particular brand, and you want to make sure that you maintain the integrity of that brand. And then, with some of the retail outlets, if you do end up having issues with some of the retail outlets, once you have a problem or there is a problem, it's very difficult to get back into those major retail outlets after you have a problem. So I think it's better to spend a little bit of time and effort and resources to be prepared and to make sure that we have the controls in place, and where we understand where our role is, or where the company's role is with respect to if there is a problem, how it's going to be handled, and making sure that everybody's on board with that.
Thank you, David. Thanks to our other speakers. We're at the end of the hour, so this wraps up our program. As it says on the screen, please take a minute to fill out the survey that's going to appear on your screen momentarily. I also invite you to contact any of today's speakers if you have additional questions or would like more information on their particular topics. Thanks again for joining us. Have a good day.